Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, and with me today is my co-host, Chuck Mason. Before we start, I want to thank the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, who is the sponsor of this program, and also Sidney Sachs and his crew for making this production possible. Today's guest is Shawn Halifax, the Executive Director of Woodlawn and Pope Leighey House, located right here in Alexandria. Those two properties are owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Shawn has almost 30 years experience working with historical museums, plantations, and houses. He's originally from Virginia and spent 3 years here working on the ownership transition of Fort Monroe from the Army to the Commonwealth. Before appointment at Woodlawn, Shawn served as the Cultural History Interpretation Coordinator for the Charleston County Park and Recreation Commission at McLeod Plantation on James Island in South Carolina. We're delighted to welcome Shawn to our show. Before we get started, or as we get started, Shawn, tell us a little bit about Woodlawn and its significance to the history of our community.
Okay, well, thank you, Janelle and Chuck, for inviting me to come in this morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. Woodlawn Plantation was once, I think we've got an image of Woodlawn, is a mansion that was built and completed in 1805. It's a Georgian-style mansion with federal overtones to it, and was the home of Lawrence and Eleanor Lewis, who were the nephew and step-granddaughter of George Washington and Martha Washington. I think we've got another image of a map. Woodlawn was left to the Lewises upon their marriage by George Washington in his will. Or as part of their wedding gift, I'm sorry. And it was one of the 5 farms that made up Mount Vernon, called Dogue Run. So as you look at this map, it'll be on the left side of the map, and it also included the items A and B on that map. So it was about 2,000 acres of property that was left to them as a gift.
But George Washington had at one time, what was it, 8,000
acres?
Yes,
8,000 acres approximately is what made up Mount Vernon. So those 5 farms, and this was one of those 5 farms. It was called Dogue Run Farm at the time. Okay. And when the Lewises acquired the property and was left to them, they changed it to Woodlawn.
Okay. Wow, that's a large property, isn't it?
It is. Today, when you think about it, it stretches, if you're familiar with Fairfax County, it stretches from about Fort Belvoir up Route 1 towards Huntley Meadows County Park.
Wow.
And kind of stays mostly north of, or west, I'm sorry, of Route 1. So it's a pretty decent sized plantation.
And so Lewis, it was Lewis's wife that was the relation to Martha Washington?
That's correct. So she was the granddaughter of Martha Washington, Nellie Custis.
Nellie Custis.
Yes, she was the granddaughter, and she married Lawrence Lewis, who was the nephew of George Washington.
Okay, so
and he had served as George Washington's personal secretary for a while.
Okay, so it's all in the family.
Yeah, I think that's how this works.
And the Custis name is familiar because of Arlington Cemetery, right?
Sure, yeah. So her brother, Nellie Custis's brother, George Washington Parke Custis, is who acquired Arlington. And so the Arlington house was part of that family's land holdings.
And that sits right on the hill.
Right on the hill, overlooking Washington, that's right.
Well, tell us about the mansion, because there's a special design there.
Sure. So for the design of the mansion has been largely attributed to William Thornton, who also designed, was part of one of the designers or architects of the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol, as well as some local places. The Tudor Place, Octagon House are 2 other locations that he's well known for having helped design. And so at Woodlawn, it looks like that its design is partly his influences, but also Lawrence Lewis, his father, Fielding Lewis, had built and owned Kenmore Plantation in Fredericksburg, which is open to the public right there in Fredericksburg, right in the city. And so it looks like when you look at Woodlawn and you look at his childhood home, you can see the similarities. That seems to have influenced the design as well.
But that was also a pretty typical look in the
this
day,
this is
right?
typical, this kind of Georgian, like at this period it kind of have the Georgian influence that had been around, and then you have the federal influences that are starting to creep in. And so when you look at Woodlawn, you'll see it's very symmetrical, the Georgian style, but you start to see things like arches and things like that that are coming in, the windows and things like that, to make it a little bit more softer.
I visited the house.
Oh, good.
It's amazing. There's still some, I guess, a few pieces that were the original ones, but it's what a view. I mean, what a fabulous place to live in today's world. And I understand that if the trees weren't there, you could actually see
Yeah,
the
so
Potomac.
in the wintertime you can see the Potomac, but this time of year when all the leaves are out, you can't really see it unless you're on the second floor. But people living in Fairfax just within the last 40, 50 years would remember being able to see Woodlawn from Route 1 because the trees on the hillside were planted in the 1990s, I think. So it's really changed the landscape there. At Woodlawn. So yeah, George Washington had picked this site as a location, and he described it as a place that was fit for a mansion.
You know, if you're doing some genealogy and you want to try to capture what life would have been like on a plantation in Virginia in that time frame, go to Woodlawn, because just looking out over that beautiful the grounds and the elevation changes, and it would give you an idea of what life could have been like, at least for the people who had lots of money.
Yes. Yeah, and that's one of the challenges. One of the things that the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and one of their initiatives over the last several years, is to tell a more full history at its historic sites. And one of the challenges to that is at places at Woodlawn, a lot of the evidence of enslaved people, the vast majority of the number of people that occupied those spaces, is no longer visible. And so through archaeology and other means is how we learn about the experiences and the lives of the people that were enslaved there. So the vast majority of the people, evidence of their existence has largely been removed as part of the historic preservation process.
Now, do they have a cemetery like Mount Vernon does for the slaves
that
were there?
So we don't really know. That's a good question.
Okay.
We have none that's identified on the site. That is today, Woodlawn is 126 acres. So it's just a fraction of what it had been at 2,000 acres. One of the things that we've done is we've met with Fairfax County Parks Authority to try to begin identifying all of the archaeological sites that were in that 2,000 acre footprint, so that we can get a better understanding of what Woodlawn was like. So being able to find a cemetery, there may be evidence of that.
Sure.
We're just not aware of that right now. There's no evidence of that on the 126 acres.
Okay.
But we suspect that settlements of people, of enslaved people, would have been in various places, maybe not on that 126 acres. We're still doing research to
Still
learn
possibly on that
Yeah.
piece of property, as opposed to them all being buried down where the slaves from Mount Vernon were
Right,
buried.
especially after 1799, after 1801, when the transfer of this property is taking place. One of the things, though, to give you a sense, though, and most people don't realize this, but if you go out to Mount Vernon today, there's a replicated home for enslaved people that's there. That home is replicated based on archaeology and work that was done on Dogue Run, which would have become Woodlawn. And so I suspect that when that property transfer occurred, they didn't knock down everything and rebuild everything, that what you see at Mount Vernon in that replicated house would have been an example of what housing would have looked like for the people living at Woodlawn under the Lewis ownership. The same is true for when you go to Mount Vernon, there's the 16-sided barn, I think, and that barn was also located on Woodlawn. And the distillery and mill that's right down there on Dogue Run, that is open to the public, that Mount Vernon owns, that also was part of Woodlawn.
Okay.
So you can still today Mount Vernon has resources that help us have a deeper understanding of what Woodlawn may have been like, especially during the Dogue Run years, but then even after, because those things continued to operate.
Right.
You mentioned the cemetery on Fort Belvoir Post. Would that be maybe?
So there is a cemetery that's associated. There's 3 cemeteries that are associated with Woodlawn. There's a cemetery at the Baptist Church, the Woodlawn Baptist Church. There's a cemetery that's associated with the Quaker Meeting House that's there right next door. And then there's a cemetery that is associated with the free black families and their descendants that had a settlement at Woodlawn. And so that cemetery is still one that I think the last person buried there was in 2019 or 2021.
Oh, really?
So that all 3 of them, I think, I don't know that they're all 3 active, but that one I was surprised is still active, or at least it was until recently.
You know, when I saw Woodlawn, I was really focused on the mansion, but I didn't think to look for the slave quarters there. And you said they're not there, but you know, like when you go to Monticello, I don't know if those are the original ones there or not either. But I'm glad you mentioned that because I hadn't thought to look for those things.
Yeah.
In the mansion itself, they said there might be one room where a slave might have either lived or stayed.
Yeah, we're looking into that. I mean, for a long time, I think the assumption is that enslaved people were maybe living in the attic. We're not sure of the main part of the house.
Ooh, that would be hot.
Yes, uncomfortable, I would imagine. But there is a floor plan for the house that was done in the 1880s, I think, and in that floor plan, it has 2 designations: how the rooms were being used currently and how the rooms had been historically during the Lewis period.
Okay.
Now, we're not exactly sure how the person that put this floor plan together knew what was being done during how the rooms were being used in the Lewis period, but it does indicate that one of the rooms in the house was used as what they say on the floor plan as servants' quarters, which would have been quarters for enslaved people.
Were there any inventories from estates, from wills?
Yes, so we do know, for instance, when Lawrence Lewis passed away, we do know that the people that were enslaved and who he left those individuals to.
What I'm thinking about, my 3rd great grandparents, their estate inventories mentioned room by room what was in there and all. And about 15 years ago now, I was finally able to, someone I know found out who the current owner was, and I was able to go up and see the house, and I took the will with me, and I was able to describe, one room that was a big bathroom was originally my 3rd great grandmother's bedroom because of the way that inventory was done room by room.
Yeah, we'll have to try that.
That might be something that you might find some helpful information there.
Just looking at this floor plan more critically is allowing us to take a look at how we use those spaces today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the Lewises lived there until when?
So the Lewises moved in. The construction of the house, and we think sometime around 1805. There's a date that's in the attic that may or may not have been the date that the construction ended. It says September 9, 1805. There's no way to know for sure. That could have been put there anytime.
Yeah.
But they moved in 1805, and they lived there really until the 1830s. When Lawrence Lewis passed away in 1839, eventually Nellie Lewis moved to Clark County with her son Lorenzo, and she lived out the rest of her life there. I think she passed away in 1852. So they were there for about 35 to 40 years or so. There was an overseer that was looking over the property for the 10-year period before Lorenzo, the son of Nellie and Lawrence, sold the property to a Quaker company, Troth and Gillingham Company. These were Quakers from New Jersey who acquired the property. They appear to have been acquaintances or business partners with Lawrence prior to purchasing the property. That's a possibility. And they acquired the property. And oftentimes what is talked about is that a lot of Woodlawn at the time, and perhaps this is where the name comes from, was still wooded. And so the Quakers have been talked about coming in as to harvest that timber.
They were in the timber business.
They were. That's what the Troth-Gillingham Company was, but that really wasn't the primary motivation for the Quakers to come to Woodlawn. And this is what I think is the other part that really makes Woodlawn significant. It's significant that it was once part of Mount Vernon, and that Nellie Lewis and Lawrence Lewis were very much engaged in promoting George Washington's legacy, so that's one reason, and William Thornton is a possible designer, makes it important in the early years for that. But during the second period of time, this group of Quakers arrives, and there's also other allies with the Quakers. There's a group of Baptists as well. And then, of course, there's a long-standing free black population in this part of Fairfax County. And so those three different groups come together at Woodlawn to create an anti-slavery colony. And that's really what was prompted the Troths and the Gillinghams to come into Woodlawn, was to be able to demonstrate that with reforms to agriculture and reforms to labor, namely getting rid of slave labor, that agriculture could be profitable in the South. And they were pretty successful at being able to do that. So over the course of years, the 2,000 acres that was once Woodlawn was subdivided up amongst a group of people that had been anti-slaverists and also free blacks, who also were presumably anti-slavery too. Although some of them, because families were, when George Washington manumitted the people that he enslaved, they were married into other families that were owned by Martha Washington, or intermarried with family members that were owned by Martha Washington. She didn't manumit, so you had family units that were both enslaved and free.
Oh, wow.
So it makes for a really kind of complicated situation, and so that's the free black colony that was here is tied into an enslaved community still, even after individuals have been manumitted. So it's it's a sensitive topic, to think about it and to talk about, and so that Woodlawn community, free black community that becomes Woodlawn, and there's several other ones in the area.
I know the Quakers were real abolitionists all over the U.S., not just here, but I mean it's kind of neat that our community, this part of this South County of Alexandria, was really a place where free blacks could come and develop these communities. And I understand that, when the Civil War came, that this area was very much interested in, anti-slavery, but we didn't want to secede compared to the rest of Virginia.
That's right. The Accotink precinct was one of the precincts in Virginia that, along with the western part of the state that eventually becomes West Virginia, voted to not secede from the United States at the time of Virginia's secession. So and that's largely because there's this large anti-slavery group of people living in that district. Interestingly, Martha Caitlin has a book that has just come out called The Quaker Scout, and so she talks a little bit about this time period during the Civil War and the Quakers that were involved. But one of the things that's really fascinating and interesting is that there's a home militia that's developed that in this precinct that is there to protect these properties from raiding Confederate forces. And it was it was started by the free blacks in the community, and then it became an integrated militia, which is pretty rare for that time period during the American Civil War.
But there was so much risk of a free black being scooped up by a trader somehow and being put back into slavery.
Yeah, especially after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And that's one of the things that I find really fascinating is we know, for instance, there was several free blacks living in the Woodlawn Mansion in the 1850 census.
Oh, really?
Yes, and one of them was Lewis Quander. And Lewis Quander, his family remained enslaved, and he ended up purchasing eventually about 200 acres of what had once been Woodlawn, and was presumably working towards being able to purchase his own family, who were enslaved, but he passed away before they were able to be emancipated. But this to me, I think about 1850 when Lewis Quander, is there. That's at the same time that the Fugitive Slave Act is passed. So he's taking a risk. He came apparently he had been in New Brunswick, Canada, and he came to Woodlawn, is there presumably when this act is either being discussed or passed. And there also happens to be a lawyer who's living at Woodlawn at the same time. So I like to think about what those conversations might have been like between someone like Lewis Quander and this lawyer discussing the ramifications of being a free black in an area where it was becoming at a time when it was becoming quite common for free blacks to be picked up and sold to places further south into the deep south.
So for our viewers, the Quander Road is sort of a boundary of that, or at least I think it's a boundary of that property.
It may be. I'm not familiar with where Quander Road is, but there's a long history of the Quander family is a long history, and it does have a history that's associated with Woodlawn as well. In fact, the first Quander family reunion was held at what was Woodlawn in that Woodlawn community.
And there's a book, if you're interested in that, there's a book written by the Quander family, actually, I think, that can give you more information on that. Before we run out of time, can you talk just briefly about the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the properties that they own? Sure.
So the National Trust for Historic Preservation is a nonprofit organization that is headquartered in Washington, D.C. Its primary purpose is to preserve our history, and it owns several properties across the country, about 27 different properties across the country that it owns, and Woodlawn and Pope Leighey House are two of those properties that it owns. And the work of the National Trust, as I said, is to interpret the history at those sites, but beyond that is to advocate for historic preservation around the country. So working with the federal government, working with state governments, local organizations, historical societies, preservation societies, providing support through services and funding is all part of the work of the National Trust for Historic Preservation.
And that's different than, because I was confused about this, so clarify the difference between the trust and the register.
Sure, so that's easy, I think, for people to get confused. So the National Trust for Historic Preservation was created by an act of Congress in its original form to support the National Park Service and its preservation of historic properties that the Park Service owned. And it separated out at some point, and I'm not exactly sure when, and it became its own nonprofit and stopped receiving federal funding.
Okay.
So the National Trust for Historic Preservation is a nonprofit organization that works to advocate for historic preservation. Then you have the National Register of Historic Places, which is a designation, a listing that is managed by the National Park Service. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these sites around the country of which they have to meet certain criteria in order for the Secretary to list them as being on the Register of Historic Places.
Okay.
And in addition to that, to confuse things even more, that's one designation, but then there's a second higher designation. And that second higher designation is the National Historic Landmark designation. And those are reserved for the most significant historic properties around the country. And Woodlawn happens to be all three. It's owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is who owns and operates it, but it also has a designation as a National Register site for historic places and also a National Historic Landmark.
Does that mean that it gets extra funding from those two?
No, it doesn't mean that it gets extra funding, but it does provide an opportunity for extra funding because of the level of the level of significance. By being designated a historic landmark, its significance is increased.
So those, when you go into Old Town Alexandria and you see the old houses with that little round thing on it, is that register, or?
It may be. It may be.
That's probably that.
They have different designations, but there's also local designations too, and the Commonwealth may have its own designation. Yeah. So I know that Woodlawn is also listed in the Virginia Historic Places as well. So it can get really confusing.
I mean, today we wanted to focus on Woodlawn, but would you just give us just a brief description of how Pope Leighey got into the mix?
So Pope Leighey House is named after the owners of the house, of which there were two families, the Popes and the Leiheys. And Lauren Pope who was a big Frank Lloyd Wright fan, had attended a lecture by Frank Lloyd Wright, and then had written him a letter and indicated that he would like to have a home designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and Frank Lloyd Wright responded. And so what was built was what becomes known as the Pope Leighey House, which was in Falls Church, Virginia.
Okay.
And it was built in 1939, and it is called it's a Usonian style home, which is small. It's 1,200 square feet, and intended to blend into the natural environment. When Interstate 66 was being expanded in 1965, it was right in the way of, it went right through the Pope Leighey House, so they moved it to Woodlawn as a way to preserve it. The Leighey family did.
So in the few minutes we have left, tell us about the events that you have at Woodlawn and how a visitor might be able to tour the property.
Sure. So Woodlawn and Pope Leighey are open Friday through Monday from 10 to 4. Right now it's by tour only, although the grounds are open to anyone for free anytime. There is a fee for the tours. You can tour both sites, or you can tour one or the other. Tours are several times a day. You can go to our website to learn more about the times of those tours. And in addition to that, we have special programs. And so, for instance, we have a book series that's coming up on September 9th. Cassandra Good, who has just written a book titled The First Family, which it looks at the Custis family. She will be doing a book talk at Woodlawn. And then Martha Catlin, author of The Quaker Scout, who I mentioned earlier, she will be doing a book talk on October 6th. And then something that we're really excited about is we have a special exhibition of what are called story quilts. This is by a fiber artist named Cheryl Sims, and she is an African American who has ties. She's a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and she also has Quaker ties. And so she uses story quilts to explore her family's roots.
Wow.
It's a really fascinating exhibition that we'll have up from October 2nd through December 30th.
Great. So go to the website and look for all of these great events. Thank you so much. This has been really interesting, and I've learned a lot, and I know our viewers will enjoy this too. So thank you, Shawn. I appreciate it.